Hi, welcome to Third Party Therapy Podcast. Delighted to be joined today by Stephen Boyer, co-founder and chief innovation officer at BitSight. We caught up to talk about the ever-increasing cyber threat. Our cyber criminals don't operate on an annual basis, and we need to adopt a more dynamic approach to understanding our cyber risk with third parties. And what can TPRM professionals actually do about it? How can we leverage data and new technologies to minimize our exposure? I hope you enjoy the conversation. Stephen, thank you very much for joining us on the Third Party Therapy Podcast today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Before we start going into all the fun topic of cybersecurity, it'd be really good just for you to give a quick update on, who you are, what drove you to set up BitSight, what keeps you passionate about this area.
So Stephen Boyer. So I'm a co-founder and chief innovation officer at BitSight. I was, in preparation for this, just thinking a little bit about, hey, what got me here. I was just thinking, hey, I spent a lot of time very young, just fascinated by technology. I built my own telegraph using electric magnets. We had early access to these bulletin board services. Early in college, I was always trying to figure out how to get into different labs and connect to different remote computers. So always just fascinated with technology, both the advantages, but also potentially the downsides and risks and where those vulnerabilities are. And so, professionally, I spent time in startups and technology, and then I spent a decade at MIT, where we're really looking at some of the cutting edge areas of technology and cyber risk. And I think there were some really key questions that we were asked by military leaders saying, hey, can I just go ahead and do my operations? Do I need to worry about this cyber thing? And we really struggled to articulate, well, how bad is it? And what are the risks? And how would that compare? And to try to really quantify. So we spent a lot of time trying to really quantify these risks. And that really led me to found BitSight to help organizations better quantify and manage and gain visibility to cyber risks.
Before we get into BitSight, because I know there's a lot to talk about BitSight, the use of data and how we can apply that within TPRM, I'd just like to get your view on the state of the cyber threat landscape over the last few years. How's that changed? What are we seeing as the big issues today that companies are facing?
Yeah, so I just read an article over the weekend. This is pretty fresh. This came, from the Wall Street Journal, where the headline is how Chinese hackers graduated from clumsy corporate thieves to military weapons.
Wow.
And I think that really sort of sums up some of the recent changes, which is, even not too long ago, people were saying, hey, these Chinese attackers were very clumsy and not very sophisticated. Now we're starting to see, very sophisticated nation state level attacks, not just on governments, right? So it's not just government on government. The article talked about this was a water utility in Hawaii or an oil and gas processing facility in Houston, right? Or just these regional airports, right? So it's really hitting just about every organization that may be impacting some either political process or it could be supply chain to some other organization, could be involved in some military application. Which is interesting is the commercial world, or what we would call the private sector, is now very much in this world of either cyber espionage or in some cases some would call it cyber warfare. And so we've seen very different cases of this. I think NotPetya, if you recall, that particular attack was based and focused in Ukraine, but then spread to all across the world, where it impacted Maersk shipping and it really impacted their operations. And so you start to see this interconnection, where I would say initially in the internet you ran your own web servers and you had your own firewall and your own little fiefdom on the internet. And now we're just so interconnected with cloud and SaaS services, and your business relies on all these other businesses to operate. And so you just have that interconnectivity combined with what is a really sophisticated set of actors. I mean, I'd use the Chinese in that example, but you do have, the cyber criminals just right there, which is probably the vast majority of what we see for the attacks. And so organizations, in some cases, are going to have to operate at a military level, which is really hard to even think that, hey, I, as a small, medium-sized enterprise, need to operate and have sort of military grade protection, but we're starting to see that, and it's not in the article it talked about just not just trying to do ransomware, but also just move in and just take out all the intellectual property or sit there quietly so they can get back in at any time. And so I think that's that shift was we went from annoying viruses that would delete your files to now organizations that just any scale have to deal with that kind of military level threat.
Absolutely. It's interesting you say that image of the Chinese threat being quite clumsy. I think if you go back 2 or 3 years, the general feeling was that the sophisticated cyber ability sat either within Russia or within Israel. Because both of those countries are involved in major conflict, have you seen an increase in cyber activity around those areas as well?
Sometimes it's hard to attribute directly to one group or the other in the world because there are false flag operations, but absolutely around conflict, we do see escalation, right? And so you see new malware coming out. I think there were some pretty well documented cases around the Ukraine where prior to and during what we would call kinetic or physical operations, there were cyber activities. We actually had the head of Ukraine cyber groups come and talk with us and said, hey, almost always there was some sort of cyber attack combined with some sort of a kinetic attack. And so that is kind of the new warfare is to be able to combine those different operations, take out their communications channels so then I can go in and have a larger advantage on the battlefield. But then you also saw attacks against different organizations that were not anywhere in the theater of battle. And so I think that has definitely been an evolution. Most of those are attacks to disrupt. Typically it was a wiperware, which is ransomware or disguised as like ransomware, but they're never trying to get a ransom. They're just trying to take the system offline. But then you do have these different operations to just try to gain intelligence.
There's been a number of cases recently of data being published on the dark web.
Yes.
Sometimes aggregated data from multiple breaches. And it seems that there's quite often a difference between the data being published and actually the companies who are allegedly affected almost admitting that they're affected. Yeah, there seems to be quite a lag. I mean, we've seen a couple of instances recently where almost the claims about what data has been taken have been vastly exaggerated, shall we say, when actually you work out the core data, it's a little bit of test data over here. It seems to be a bit of a marketing thing going on from the hackers as well in terms of trying to boost what their image in terms of what they're actually doing. Is that sort of masking some of the problem? They're making the problem seem bigger than it actually is, do you think?
So I actually that's maybe more of a little bit of a recent thing, which is, hey, we've stole X number of gigs, right? And turned out to be not super sensitive, but I would say in the majority of the time, it's sensitive. Yeah. So I'll just use an example of Medibank that happened in Australia, and they were attacked, and then they were asked, to pay the ransom, and they said, no, we're not going to pay it. But it was information on millions of Australians, right, and very sensitive medical information, right, and then we've learned many years later from the police that information led to I think some 10,000 plus crimes because now you've got personal identifiable information, right? So that can be super super damaging. Oftentimes what doesn't get reported is these organizations pay the ransom because it is sensitive information. And oftentimes the thieves do not publish it because otherwise no one would ever pay the next ransom. Yeah. So I think there's probably, some blend of that where, the information, does get published, but the business model of these criminals is, hey, we're going to release it. You do not want it released. And so people pay. So there's probably some blend of exaggeration of claims, especially if someone's refusing to pay. I would say in some of these cases, the organizations have paid, and then it somehow gets out, But usually, yeah, it's, if they pay, it doesn't necessarily get out. So there are a couple different models there,
Yeah.
for how that works, and usually it's in the interest of the criminals to follow that protocol. Hey, if you pay, we're not going to release.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this is a third party podcast, so I want to drill into the third party side. You talked
Yes.
earlier about the interconnectedness of
Yes.
Organizations, the use of cloud, which is immediately a third party. That use of third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties, etc., that must be increasing the cyber threat. Do you see that as well, or is it one of the trains of thought is that because we're using organizations like Microsoft, Amazon, etc., who have good cyber capability, that actually our use of third parties is strengthening our cyber security, or is it a bit of a mix of both?
I would agree that it's a mix of both. If you were to look at the news over the last 3-4 years, Microsoft itself has been the target and victim of many cyber attacks, right? So just because you're the large, big one doesn't mean you're immune from that. I would say that aggregation and professionalization of cloud services has in many ways made things better. Meaning most organizations have no business running their own web server, running their own mail, that sort of thing, keeping that up to date, blocking spam, et cetera. So by using those services, in many ways, we are better off. On the other hand, that data is going somewhere else. It's outside your control. And so when somebody were to attack that, they not only just have you, but they may have thousands of other customers as well that they can exploit. And so that's that trade-off, which is, hey, we may have shifted some of those responsibilities to a service provider, but if that service provider is a substantial size, they are a substantial target, and then that can be exploited. And you may not even be targeted, but then become a victim through that. And so this is that trade. And I think as the listeners here need to understand is that is the risk management part of this, which is, hey, how much are we going to go and trust and delegate, to somebody else? How much are we going to do ourselves? And then how would we know if we're doing a good job? Right? I think that's like, how do we know we made the right decision? Is a trickier one. And so I do think that the complexity, though, has gone up because we benefit from all these different services. Instead of just going and walking over to my server closet and hitting reboot on my 5 servers, I am working with all sorts of different people, right? And I don't control it. I can't just hit the reset button on those different services. I've got to call somebody, or I've got to send them an email. I've got to engage with somebody else. And so you do get the benefits of the professionalization of those things, but you do cede some control. Yeah. And so I think that's that part, which is that is the trade. And if that counterparty to whom you've ceded that control is not doing a good job, or has an issue, that flows to you.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's that chain, and you can't just, call someone up in the middle of the night and have them move like you would have a normal employee do it. That's you're depending on them to operate.
Absolutely. And then that unique element to the shared responsibility model in terms of,
exactly,
they give you the tools and you have to configure it, adds a bit more complexity. So in terms of, have we given our data to the right companies? Are they doing a good job? That seems like a good segue into the role of, BitSight and the use of data. Could you just give us a quick view of, what is BitSight? What does BitSight do? What can it offer? And how can we start applying it to those challenges?
Yeah, so BitSight is a cybersecurity risk management company, right? And we really help our customers prioritize and identify cyber risk, right? And so to be able to quantify that and manage that whole process for your own performance, and then for that broader supply chain, which is what we say is broader you. You are the combination of all of your, services and suppliers. And not everyone always thinks about it that way, but right now with this new world of interconnection, you as you operate are the combination of your machines and all the machines and services that you use. And so we really help our customers focus on, hey, well, where are my challenges? How am I doing? And then what do I go do to focus to reduce that risk? And so that could be for my own attack surface, also for the broader attack surface of my supply chain. And to just kind of make that concrete, I'll use an example of NASA. You may know NASA. They put men on the moon. They launch satellites across the solar system, and you can imagine they have a very complex supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's just not NASA building and deploying every single thing that they send out into space. They work with a huge supply chain. Now we have work with them where they have to get through about 3,000 suppliers when they need to do cybersecurity due diligence. They have many more, but that's where they've identified risk. And the challenge there is always, do I have enough people? Do I have enough resources? Right? And so doing cybersecurity due diligence, that could be the assessments, that could be monitoring, that will take some resources, and every organization's got to figure out what's that scale. But for NASA, it's about 3,000.
Okay.
And by working with us, by helping them get the visibility, the workflow, the reporting, the assessments, they were able to see about a 50% efficiency gain.
Okay.
Right. And when you think about a 50% efficiency gain, that's real money. Right? They were able to do more with less. And I think that's where, a lot of people think, I know I need to be doing this, but how do I do this efficiently? And so we're able to help them meet their regulatory requirements. They had to do something that they call Section 889, assessments, where they needed to know, hey, is this particular service or vendor banned? Right. And we can help we can identify certain technologies that are banned. Those, they had to make sure that their vendors meet a certain standard, and we can help quantify and automate, some of that. And then just really help them collaborate, because once they identify issues with their third parties, then they've got to help them, right? They got to help work with them to get those things resolved. Because oftentimes what we find is that these third parties aren't even aware of some of their security issues, vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, compromises. And so to collaborate there. And so that does take time, right? That takes effort. And so, working, with NASA, they're able to do something at pretty large scale, do all of those different things, and do it with a 50% efficiency gain.
So I think that's interesting, because a lot of organizations are still in that questionnaire, point in time, due diligence, assessment approach. And I think that's one of the areas that can definitely be addressed by BitSight, or dare I say it, other similar solutions. That it's about efficiency. How can we do the same number of assessments with less, or arguably, how can we do more assessments with the same people?
Yes. Yeah. And I think there are, and this is where the risk management piece comes in, which is, hey, I made, from a compliance standpoint, just need them to answer a few questions. How do I have them answer those questions? Well, I could send it, I could go over email. I could have them send me some documents, and I got to store it, right? Or you can build a whole workflow around, asking questions, collecting information, and that sort of thing. And then the question would be, did they answer that correctly? Is that up to date? How would I know? Yeah. Right. And so then you need to be able to monitor. You want to be able to monitor and gain some sort of evidence and kind of a trust but verify. And so that's what we're constantly, every day, collecting billions and billions of signals across the internet about you and your supply chain. That would be an indication of how well they've answered, or they're operating on those things. And then you may need to know, well, hey, from a business continuity standpoint, who are they dependent on? Right? And they may tell me some, but that may change, or they may have neglected. I think I want to be able to detect that. And that's so you start to think about what we call fourth party, which is, who would that? And then the next logical question is, hey, well, what are the threat actors doing? Are the threat actors targeting this vendor? Maybe they've got pretty good controls, but now I know the threat actors are targeting their specific applications in the regions that they operate in. So maybe I need to, have some conversations around that. So it is different levels of degrees, and that's pretty easy for 4 or 5 vendors. You can really lock in. Where it gets really tricky when you start to think about dozens or hundreds or thousands, or even some of these tens of thousands, right? And that's where you really need to be able to systematically think about it, have some tools and workflow to be able to execute on that.
Absolutely. Now you touched on three things that I'd just like to go into in a little bit more detail there. And so you touched on that sort of dynamic aspect. So moving away from the point in time, every year we do an assessment, to a more constant monitoring what's changed approach. And one assumes as well is if you do that, you don't necessarily need to do the annual review because you're constantly revising. Are you seeing a lot of organizations moving away from that point in time to a more dynamic monitoring approach?
So I'd say it's kind of both. And I would say both, meaning from a onboarding standpoint, there's usually like, hey, I need to onboard. Like if I've got a new vendor, I need to bring them on and do that assessment. And that's historically what a lot of people have done is they've done that assessment and then that was it.
Yeah.
And then if you're a little more mature, you would do it on some sort of frequency. And naturally humans, we do things like on an annual basis.
Yeah.
12 months is the magical number, right? So then you would do it on that sort of assessment. What we have learned and it's become now more clear in the cybersecurity world is no threat actor works on a 12-month cycle, right? And vulnerabilities don't appear on a 12-month cycle. It's like that is constant. And so to really get that visibility into the risk and to be able to be on management, you need more frequent updates than that. And so this is where your processes have to change to be able to adapt to the actual threat landscape that we started the whole conversation with. And so we are seeing about what we call a major security event about twice a month.
Right.
Vendor announces some major vulnerability and now everybody's in a scramble. Right. And so now you need to know, how are we impacted? How is my supply chain impacted? Have they resolved it? Have they not resolved it? Did they, that sort of thing. And so if that's happening twice a month, that is obviously by definition not annual. Now you're needing to be able to engage, right? And so where we see people trying to get to is, hey, how am I not be on my back foot? Can I get more proactive on this? Can I, when major vulnerability is announced, quickly go and say, across my portfolio, 10% of my vendors actually have this application. Okay, that obviously helps me scope things down, right? And then it's like, okay, and then how many are actually vulnerable? And then what is their response? And so if I've got a way to get that visibility and then prioritize, now I know where I may need to be able to spend my time.
Yeah.
If you're waiting until the annual assessment, it may be way too late, right? It's like, hey, 7 months ago, did you have that issue? Oh, you know what? Maybe we did. Right? So that's where moving at the speed of where the cybersecurity market is. I would say not everyone's there, but I think that generally the move, and even from government regulatory standpoint, is you need to do some form of what's called continuous monitoring, which that may be looking for alerts and maybe looking for something, searching on the web. There may be services like BitSight you can use on that. But that's where you want to have some awareness of where you may need to focus, for your supply chain partners that's going to trigger that. And so that's where I'd say that time is just getting shorter and shorter because things are very, very dynamic. And so to go and say, hey, we only look at this once a year, I think is just not going to be sufficient.
No, not at all. And I think that's quite key. And I think there's always two sides to that as well. And that was one of the other areas I wanted to pick up on, which is that threat landscape piece, because there's one thing, you have a supplier, ABC Limited, on monitoring, something happens, you find out about it and you work with them. But what is also happening is that you get the news stories. So, Move IT or
Yes.
or whatever, something has happened out there, and your immediate thought or your immediate question is, does that affect me? I don't have a relationship with that company that's had a breach, but does it affect me? And then you're then tracing back whether they appear, are they a fourth party, a fifth party, etc. And I think that threat landscape. So how can we use data solutions like BitSight to expand our awareness of supply chain? Because I think a lot of organizations are really struggling with this fourth and fifth party piece. The natural propensity is to look at your material suppliers and their material subcontractors. So the one, or material fourth party. So the ones that are doing core parts of the service that you take from the third party. Whereas a lot of these vulnerabilities or attacks are affecting, let's say, infrastructure level applications that are sitting out there that you may not pick up on it. So can we also use these data solutions like BitSight to expand our visibility of the supply chain as well?
Yeah, so let's start right with your example of Move IT or MOVEit, where that is a file transfer service that was used by many organizations, but turns out it wasn't like millions of organizations.
No.
Right? So this is not just a common piece of software. It was fairly concentrated. Our team, I want to say, found somewhere around 1,200 instances of it across the internet. When you think about that, that's actually not that many. And then there was a major vulnerability announced that was exploited, and data was able to be stolen. And it turns out that if you had just asked your third party, "Hey, we're using MOVEit," they may or may not have known, right? But they may have said, "Yeah, we patched it," and actually it actually wasn't obvious because there were many versions. Actually, once the first vulnerability was announced, then there was another vulnerability, and then another. I want to say there was more than 5 different CVEs or vulnerabilities for that particular service, and so you would want to know which version. And so we do very specific testing where we were able to find out, hey, it was actually this specific version. And so they may have thought they had dealt with it at day one, but it turns out days later, if they hadn't dealt with it, they would have missed it and still been warned. So you want to be able to see that, like which versions of software are they using, even if they thought they had addressed it. We've seen cases where somebody patched, but they had been exploited before they patched. So the back door was already on the system.
Yeah.
And so we were able to find out, hey, yes, they patched, but the back door's already there.
Yeah.
Right. So they've been compromised. So that's a little bit different thing. Then you start to think about, well, what are the other dependencies other than just directly that particular piece of software? And so this is where we are looking at all the different interconnections that can be observable both technically and then maybe what we would call firmographically, which is any information that might be out there, published, such as partnerships, press releases. Hey, we work with this particular company, or legal filings that in those legal filings, they talk about those things. And so then you would say, okay, maybe I don't have a direct relationship with MOVEit, but do my third parties. We would call that fourth party. And so you can start to expand that out to all sorts of different relationships. So one of the major events that happened over the last year was CrowdStrike. Now, CrowdStrike, is an agent that runs on, literally millions of devices that protect those devices, except when CrowdStrike pushed an update to certain Windows machines, it caused those machines to crash. Immediately, people were wondering, wow, are we using CrowdStrike? One, they should probably know that, but maybe they didn't. And two, is our third party using it, right? Are we going to see an outage? Are they going to fail to deliver the services to us that we would anticipate? And so immediately our customers are coming to us asking the question, how am I impacted to this CrowdStrike outage? And that's the natural question. How is that going to impact us? So there's a sort of IT question, and then there's the higher level business question that business leaders are going to want to know. Hey, Mike, what's going to happen to us? And that is oftentimes a struggle for people to understand, especially if they can answer that usually for their own system. That's much more difficult to answer for somebody else.
Yeah.
And so where we're helping is to be able to identify. What we were able to do is traffic analysis, where we're able to look at machines that were beaconing back to CrowdStrike update servers, and then watch where they're coming back from.
Yeah.
And then we're able to see, okay, these companies, these organizations are using CrowdStrike. And then we could even see the stopping connections. And so it's like, hey, they maybe have an outage, right? It's like they were beaconing every day, and now they're not beaconing anymore. Okay, well, it's likely that they are impacted by this outage to some degree. Getting to that without some degree of automation is really hard. Yeah. So that may take you weeks or months to send that out. Hey, how are you packed? If at that point, it may no longer be relevant. So that's the kind of thing, and that's just one, right? You think about all of the other things that could happen: cloud service outages, downtime, et cetera. Answering that question, what is our risk and how we're impacted, that's that complexity that we started the conversation with. And so that is one where we really help organizations zoom in on this, be able to look at that at scale, and then ask those sorts of questions and try to quantify how are we impacted and what do we want to do.
And I think it's an interesting one, because whether you look at CrowdStrike, whether you look at MOVEit, interesting, both of those products, as I said before, wouldn't naturally appear on an organization's critical fourth party list.
Exactly.
And so this is less about being able to map out all the fourth parties, because it's not just about MOVEit and CrowdStrike. It's about all the other infrastructure level products, of which there are thousands of them out there. This is about ability to react quickly when something does happen, which I think ultimately a lot of TPRM is about. It's about having the information, having that ability to react quickly and minimize impact as soon as you find out about it. And the more we can automate that, and the more we can move away from more manual email, pick up the phone, Excel spreadsheets and things like that, the quicker we can actually be to react, can't we?
And I agree on the response time. And where I think a lot in the industry would like to get to is, can we be on the front end of that?
Yeah.
Can we be a little bit more proactive instead of responding? And this is where a lot of conversations that I've had over the last 6 months that I hadn't had in years, which is, how do I start to look at my dependencies? Can I have a business continuity plan that for certain services that I have a second source or a second vendor for that I hadn't really thought about? And doing that for your own self is not easy, but at least you kind of know. Doing it for your supply chain becomes really hard. And so how many of my vendors are running on Amazon Web Services in Europe? Well, I could ask them. That could change within weeks or months because they may move things around. Right? I was like, now I can actually measure. I look at the different services they're running. I see where they're running. I see the infrastructure that they're on. I know how much is in Europe versus in the US versus in South America. And so I'm getting to those sorts of analyses to where now maybe I can plan for that. It was like, I'm actually going to procure from a vendor who's got services in these different geographies. So now I've already, think about that in advance, or I'm going to procure from these different groups that have this diversity of suppliers as opposed to single source. So if that one single source goes down, I don't know if they will. I don't know about anything in advance, but if they do, okay, now I think I've got some sort of backup. So I'd say that is more I would call graduate level. We definitely see that in cyber insurance, where they are looking at what they call risk aggregation. And so they are definitely worried about, single points of failure. And what does that mean as things roll down? But I have started to see now these business continuity teams start to say, okay, I'd like to be able to look at this in advance. So it's not all reactive.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are talking, as you quite rightly say, we're trying to get on the front foot. And I think a lot of organizations, quite frankly, are still playing catch up, still need to go through that move from point in time to dynamic monitoring. Can we use solutions like BitSight to prevent cyber attacks? Or is it is it more focusing on the reaction times and the information sharing, do you think?
So no one can prevent an attack, right? I mean, someone's going to try to come at you, but you might want to limit how successful it is, right? And I think that's where I'm like, hey, there will be attackers that are going to go at you. But what we absolutely see is a way to get ahead of issues that may get exploited, right? Or something that spreads. For example, we've had customers who have been able to identify malware that's on their system before it spreads and causes, a ransomware event, for example, right? So the ransomware gets on the system, it beacons out, we detect that, we notify, and they're able to quickly respond. And we call that, the time to respond, or the duration of these things. The faster that you respond, the less likely it's going to get, bigger or out of hand. And so we've had a lot of customers tell us, hey, we didn't know about this. We were able to get ahead of it. Even though we had an incident, we were able to limit, kind of the spread or the particular damage. And then the other one is like, hey, we onboarded this vendor. We're taking a look at that. Before we give them any data, we identified, these 6 things that we wanted them to be able to address. And so they work through with them. We talk, they get those things addressed, and now they're able to go ahead and engage. And so it's hard to prove that they prevented a cyber attack, but they limited that attack surface that they had maybe been worried about. They removed that configuration issue that may have caused a problem or some sort of data leakage or that sort of thing in advance. And so that's that part, which is, hey, maybe there would have been attacked, maybe it would have been exploited, but you've limited that potential attack surface there in that particular engagement. You do that enough, you do that across a portfolio, and now you're really starting to have an impact there on the enterprise. You do that again and again and again. The challenge is, and this is something that we'll always face in industry, it just takes one gap.
Yeah.
Or a single connection, right? That could lead to something. But the best that we have is to try to automate this and do this as efficiently as we can. I think the NASA, case, to try to reduce that, as quickly and respond as quickly. But I do think that doing that work up front, continuously monitoring throughout the year, there are things that you can do to engage early. And the earlier you engage, the less likely there's something to go on and become really damaging.
So it feels like we've gone through quite a significant uptick in cyber activity, geopolitical events that have driven that, and also the focus that we've had from regulators, customers, etc. on this topic. Where do you see this going in the next few years? We've got new regulations coming out. We've got DORA in the financial sector in Europe. We've got NIS2 coming out. How do you see the whole third-party cyber landscape panning out for the next, 4 or 5 years, something like that?
Well, so how we got here is now changing where we're going to go from. And how we got here is now, whichever study you look at, it's a large fraction of these breaches that are coming through a third-party source, right? So right now, it's not just like someone goes directly to you, they'll go to somebody else and then they'll move over. And these are for major, organizations in the last, few years. And so now regulators are paying attention, like, hey, this is a national security level issue. And we started out with that Chinese article. That's a national security issue when water treatment facilities and power plants are being targeted by nation state actors. And so now governments realize, wait a minute, our national security, our economic activity is dependent on these systems. We need to do something about it. And so that's where the regulation has come in. It's been there for a little while, but I would say now they're starting to have some teeth, just like we had with GDPR and some of these fines. This is where some of these regulations are starting to have some teeth. I would say I'll use this case as what we can look to sort of in the future. So I'll use this example of the country of Belgium. So Belgium has this group called the Center for Cybersecurity Belgium, or the CCB. And they have the task of monitoring the critical infrastructure for the country. And so we partner with them, and we are looking across the entire country, all the organizations that are operating in Belgium, to identify issues. And so they send out letters. They say, hey, sir, at this company, we've identified this particular vulnerability. It could be a Cisco vulnerability, it could be MOVE-IT. From a national security perspective, we think you should address it. So you can think about that as a large supply chain third-party problem, right? That's a very one. But now they have changed their laws. Belgium was actually one of the first to put in place their country-level regulations for NIS2. And NIS2 is probably one of the latest, sets of regulations for cybersecurity in Europe. And each country has to take that cybersecurity directive and implement it into its own law. And so Belgium has implemented, their laws, and they have created this program called Cyber Fundamental Assessment.
Okay.
And so they are assessing, they have provided these tools to their the companies, their fellow countrymen, to be able to assess. And then the government is monitoring and they're following up, right? And then they're showing that pattern. And then they're giving access to those companies to say, hey, we've identified this issue. Here's how you should think about it for your program. And here's how you should monitor your third parties. And how you should think about your supply chain risk as well. And so it really creates this systematic approach where you're being very data driven and automated, and you're doing that at a large scale. And so I do see that. And then, of course, it's the government's role to hold people accountable. And that's where there will be, some follow up, potential enforcement actions over time. I think we'll see that. We've seen a little bit of that, from a regulatory perspective around GDPR. I do think we'll start to see this here with these new regulations. The new regulations require you to look at your supply chain. They require you to assess your supply chain and critical suppliers. So it's going to be interesting to watch and see what happens if you didn't. What happens if you just decided to do that one-time manual assessment at the start, or you just said, oh, we're going to look at them every 3 years. And so because they're asking, you need to be able to do some sort of monitoring. Now, what exactly is sufficient monitoring, I think will ultimately, get tested through enforcement. But what Belgium is starting to do is set a little bit of the standard, which is continuous, data-driven. I'm looking at everything that I can observe. And so I think that's an interesting one. And you'll see them, they're starting to set that model, that at the country level, they're worried about water treatment facility, regional airports, et cetera, that could be impacted and impact their national security. And of course, the supply chain to those. And so because it becomes totally intractable, if you don't sort of set some bounds around it, these regulations like NIS2 start to say, well, hey, if you're this size or you have this much revenue, then you're this level of criticality. So they do start to tier it and prioritize. And just like in any of these programs, you're going to have to tier and prioritize. But I think that at the country level, it's an interesting model that they're just taking very seriously, where they're saying, hey, we're turning this into a big third-party risk problem at the government level. And so we're just trying to scale it as best they can.
And I think that's a very interesting change in tack for the regulators, is to not just sit there and say, you need to have an approach to this, but they're actually then monitoring the ongoing cyber position and following up on it. So they're doing dynamic monitoring over their critical utilities. So those critical utilities are going to have to do dynamic monitoring over their third parties. Otherwise, they're going to be surprised a lot, I guess.
Yes, and I think there's surprising, but I think this is just where we're talking about. Well, if I can reduce that time to respond, right? Which is if everybody is trying to do their very best, then you do the response. Because the article we started out with is most of the attacks that were cited here, by the Chinese military, were vulnerabilities that were already known. And this is not, they were pulling some 0 days. I think there was a couple rare cases where they're previously undiscovered vulnerabilities, but on the vast majority, these were vulnerabilities already known.
Yeah.
So if the government of Belgium is letting you know, if your suppliers are letting you know, if your own processes are letting you know, hey, we've got these known vulnerabilities, let's address them quickly. Right. And so we've done some studies last year where we looked at what are called the known exploited vulnerability list. The US has a group called CISA that publishes what's called the KEV list, known exploited vulnerabilities. These aren't just vulnerabilities that are announced. These are vulnerabilities that had observed exploitation, meaning somebody out there saw an attacker exploit this vulnerability. So you think, hey, we ought to prioritize those, right? And so even if you were just looking at, hey, what are the KEVs on my infrastructure and my supply chain, you're already ahead of the game, which is these are the ones that I should prioritize because they're known exploited. However, when we looked at this, the time to remove 50% of these KEVs was almost 6 months. We looked across every industry and geography. It takes about 6 months for half of these KEVs to go away. That's not long for attackers to exploit.
No.
The more sophisticated you are, the tighter that window can become, right? And so this is where I think regulation, more sophisticated processes will just drive this. And doing that the old way of just, calling somebody up or emailing, that's where that just not isn't tractable anymore. So we do have to be able to automate and put some sort of processes around it to make that faster. But it's like, hey, the faster you can receive kevs, the less likely someone's going to be able to use that attack against vulnerabilities that are known.
Yeah, absolutely. So just moving forward in terms of people's takeaways from this, one of the things that we like to do on this podcast is learn from experience. Obviously, a lot of this is new to a lot of people. One of the things is just calling out things that maybe haven't gone so well. When people are looking to use data solutions such as BitSight with their third parties, what are some of the lessons learned that you would encourage people to learn from and maybe not do or approach with caution?
Yeah, so I'd say it's easy to go out and buy software. You got to go get the budget, you got to procure it. But to really get the best impact, you have to organizationally buy in and get the right players together. What we've seen where people have not been as successful with us is somebody acquired the capability, but they didn't build in the process for how to bring in a procurement group or how to bring the legal team in the loop. So we've got the contract. So when we do follow up, we have the rights to actually engage and ask them questions. And so this is a multifunctional problem. Right. This is not just a one small group. Maybe you can monitor an alert and then that alert may go into the ether because nobody can follow up. Or now you need to engage with the teams that own the relationships, the relationship managers with those third parties. Because to be able to do anything, you have to be able to get to the right person at the other organization. And so where it doesn't go well is where if it's just one group in isolation tackling this, yes, you may have the visibility, but you're not going to have that impact unless you have the ties and that process across the organization to be able to understand how do we handle this at the procurement level? How do we handle this at the legal level? How are we doing it at the enterprise relationships, right? So how do we report up? All right, so we can demonstrate that impact. So that's where things are, I would say, fall apart. But then when they're really successful is you've got all the different players in place. We do these workshops where oftentimes we bring together these different stakeholders. It's the first time they're meeting each other at these organizations. Whoa, hey, I didn't even know you. Well, this is so great. Well, now let's figure out how this can work. And so I'd say it goes wrong when that's not functioning well. It can go really well when those different pieces are coordinated.
Absolutely. And I think that's quite a key point, and we've talked about it on previous podcasts as well, is solutions like BitSight or a number of these other solutions, they don't take the risk decision and risk appetite away from you as an organization. They facilitate that decision. They may speed it up, they may give you better information, but fundamentally you have to be able to consume it effectively to make it successful, don't you?
Absolutely. Right. And it's got to be the right stakeholders, depending on the size of the organization, that may be many different groups.
Absolutely. So if people are sitting there sitting there with their paper questionnaires or Excel questionnaires, looking to take that step into using a solution like BitSight for either more efficient assessment or more dynamic monitoring, what would you say would be the first couple of steps that people should take in terms of delivering an effective solution or engaging an effective solution around that?
Well, I think you articulated it really well right away, which is, hey, what are you trying to accomplish, and what is the risk appetite here, and then what are the constraints that you have to operate? Yes, you're regulated. If you're under NIS2, well, now you got a regulatory mandate, right? So you say, what are we trying to do? Some organizations are saying we're just trying to be risk-based. We have no regulatory oversight, but we're really just trying to manage the business risk of the operation. Start with, hey, what's that very specific goal that you're trying to accomplish? The fact that you already have a list of vendors in the spreadsheet is a great first step. A lot of people aren't even there, right? It's like, hey, I need to be able to articulate, here is my universe of dependencies that I believe that I have inside of my organization. And so I need to be able to say, well, how would I prioritize those? and which ones do I think could cause real harm? And start with that, because then we can help you engage and make that process more efficient. We can help you engage identifying vendors that you may not have known about. We can help you monitor that. We can help you integrate with other processes inside your business. But you will need to be able to start with, hey, these are the things that I'm trying to accomplish. This is where I'm trying to gain visibility and some efficiencies. And then we can help you drive there. I think where you would want to be successful is get the quick win. Get the quick win where you can say, hey, here's how we've improved this process 50%. Here's how we gained this visibility, got this alerting, and worked with this one particular vendor, and we reduced the risk or avoided a potentially damaging event. And then once you have that, and then how do we scale it?
Yeah.
Right? How do I just make it even more automated? How do I get even more visibility? And we can absolutely help you do that. And I think it's more like, hey, setting that target and goal in mind, that you're trying to accomplish, because these big bang projects, we can help you get there. Sometimes they struggle, where we don't even know, the problem is so big, right, that you may not get the progress that you want. Where I think it's just, hey, set and start with a constrained set, make that program and process successful, and then go from there.
Brilliant. Now, that's really useful. And so thank you very much for taking the time to go through this. I think this is going to be an area that grows and grows and grows and becomes even more focused through TPRM solutions as we move forward. But Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the podcast today. And I hope you have a great day.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to Third Party Therapy. If you like that, why not click on the like button below and subscribe so you get updates in the future, and head over to thirdpartytherapy.com and sign up to our mailing list. Thank you very much.